Hello, this is part 43 of our comparative Bible study on the beginning of Jesus Galilean Ministry. During this part, we would like to introduce the Sermon on the Plain and also compare it to the introduction of the Sermon on the Mount. Overall, this is our 83rd New Testament Bible study. During the previous 5 Bible studies, we discussed the Lord Jesus making 12 of his disciples apostles. Just prior to that, in New Testament Bible Study 76, we discussed a conspiracy to destroy the Lord Jesus. Then in New Testament Bible Studies 77 and 78, we discussed some of the Lord Jesus' responses to that conspiracy, or at least things that Jesus did after learning of the conspiracy. Among other things, Jesus had departed to the sea. Then he went up into a mountain where he made 12 of his disciples apostles. And that brings us to where we are now. Jesus is going to come down out of the mountain and do a sermon on the plain. Note here that Jesus' disciples were with him up in the mountain because he was making them apostles. Okay, let's start with today's Bible study. Staying in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, here this passage ends with verse 13. In verses 14, 15, and 16, which we just discussed in previous Bible studies, that's the list of Jesus' 12 apostles. Picking up in the very next verse, in verse 17, there we read, "And he came down with them and stood in the plain." It appears that them here is Jesus' disciples. As we discussed earlier, he went up into the mountain with his disciples and made 12 of them apostles. And also, the plain here, as you can imagine, this is probably why it's called Sermon on the Plain. He came down and stood in the plain. So far in this Bible study series on the beginning of Jesus Galilean Ministry, we've been primarily following along with the Gospel of Luke, trying to work in other Gospels as appropriate. One reason for this is the theory out there that the Gospel of Luke is chronological. This primarily comes from the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, where the words appear to indicate that it is written in order. At least this is a reference that I've seen used as evidence that Luke is chronological. Now, different from a chronological order would be a topical order or arranged by topic. There are some who believe that the Gospel of Matthew is arranged in a topical format, in particular, 5 main discourses, the first of which being the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, essentially at the beginning of what I'm calling Jesus Galilean Ministry. As mentioned in previous Bible studies, I've delayed discussing the Sermon on the Mount in detail until we had more comparable verses in other Gospels to compare it to. Now that we are on the Sermon in the Plain, this appears to be an appropriate time. I believe most people are more likely to have heard the phrase Sermon on the Mount than the phrase Sermon in the Plain. One reason for this could be that the Sermon on the Mount is a longer sermon. Doing a side-by-side comparison, the Sermon on the Mount is at least 3 chapters long, whereas the Sermon on the Plain fills up most of Luke chapter 6, less than 1 chapter. Both sermons appear to cover some of the same information, and both sermons contain a lot of wisdom. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the Sermon on the Mount sounds familiar because it's often quoted. So why is the Sermon on the Mount called the Sermon on the Mount? In Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, we read, "And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him." So Jesus went up into a mountain, and his disciples came unto him, as opposed to him coming down from a mountain with his disciples into a plain. So they appear to have been given from 2 different locations at 2 different times. The Sermon on the Mount very well could have been before the Sermon on the Plain, at least from what I think I know now. To help with further comparison, looking at these verses at the beginning of each of the sermons, I've highlighted similar information with similar colors. Let's begin with reading the verses in the Gospel of Matthew immediately before the Sermon on the Mount. Here we read, "And Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people. And his fame went throughout all Syria. And they brought unto him all sick people that were taken with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those that had the palsy, and he healed them. And there followed him great multitudes of people from Galilee, and from Decapolis, and from Jerusalem, and from Judea, and from beyond Jordan. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him." Okay, let's look at the preceding verses for the Sermon in the Plain. Here we read, "And he came down with them, and stood in the plain, and the company of his disciples, and a great multitude of people out of all Judea and Jerusalem, and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, which came to hear him, and to be healed of their diseases. And they that were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out of him, and healed them all." So here I've highlighted in yellow references to Jesus healing people. So the verses preceding the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain indicate that Jesus was healing people. Also, the Sermon on the Plain, it indicates that people came to hear Jesus. In the Gospel of Luke, for the Sermon in the Plain, we're also given additional information for how he healed them. There went virtue out of him. So what were they being healed of? In the Gospel of Luke, for the Sermon on the Plain, it simply states diseases. The Gospel of Matthew states all manner of sickness and all manner of disease, and likewise diverse diseases and torments also. Furthermore, the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount states that there were those there who were lunatic, and also those that had the palsy. Also, for the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, we're similarly told that there were those there who were possessed with devils or had unclean spirits. For the Gospel of Matthew, at least it states these things in the verses preceding the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe one difference between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain could be the audience who was there. Although both the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount state that there were people there from Judea and Jerusalem, which is in southern Israel, which is south of both the regions of Samaria and Galilee, the Gospel of Matthew, prior to the Sermon on the Mount, indicates there were people there also from Decapolis. From looking at Bible maps, which are only as good as the people who did them, the region of Decapolis appears to be to the southeast of Galilee on the other side of the Jordan River. Furthermore, of the great multitudes there for the Sermon on the Mount, it lists that there were people there from beyond Jordan, which also appears to be people to the east of the Jordan River. In contrast, the Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke does not mention these people from the east. Now, the great multitude there in the Sermon on the Plain does mention people being there from Tyre and Sidon, which is from the northwest. The Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount state that Jesus' fame went throughout all Syria. Syria is also to the north. From the context, does it appear that people were brought from Syria to be healed, but Syria is not listed in this great multitudes of people following Jesus? Something interesting is that the Sermon on the Mount specifically lists that there were people from Galilee, whereas they are not specifically listed in the Sermon on the Plain. Let's stop here for now. Lord willing, maybe we'll have another Bible study in the future. If I got to share anything good, it's a blessing from God. Goodbye.